It's not easy to admit this, but I cheated once. Just once. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just a stupid impulse I could hide and forget. But mistakes don't disappear just because you try to bury them. The truth has a way of resurfacing, and mine tore through the people I loved most. Now, every day feels like I'm living inside the shadow of my own betrayal. When people talk about betrayal, they usually picture it happening to them. Nobody wants to imagine themselves as the one who caused it. But here I am, years later, admitting that I was the one who crossed the line. And the hardest part is knowing that it wasn't something forced on me. It wasn't a mistake I stumbled into blindly. I had choices. I had warnings flashing in my head. And still, I ignored every single one of them. Back then, my life looked ordinary. Stable, even. I was married, had a home that felt warm and safe, and people around me who believed I was trustworthy. On the outside, there was nothing wrong. We had dinners at the same table. We laughed about stupid TV shows. We shared a bed every night. It was the kind of life most people fight to build, and I almost believed I deserved it. But here's the part one don't like admitting. I was restless. Not in love, not out of love, just restless. That kind of quiet dissatisfaction that eats at you slowly, like a drip of water on stone. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just an inner voice whispering that something was missing. Instead of dealing with it, instead of being honest, I shoved it down and pretended it wasn't there. Then came the night that changed everything. It wasn't planned, it wasn't calculated. It was stupid and impulsive. One moment of weakness. One night, I convinced myself wouldn't matter. I told myself it would stay buried, that nobody needed to know. And for a while, it did feel hidden. No one suspected anything. I went back to my normal life, back to the routine, back to pretending that nothing had happened. But the thing about secrets is that they don't really stay quiet. Not when guilt is living inside you. I noticed the way my laugh sounded different at the dinner table, the way silence stretched in conversations where it hadn't before. My partner didn't know, at least not then, but something in me had shifted. And it was obvious, even if I thought I was hiding it. I could have confessed right away. I could have said it was a mistake, begged for forgiveness, and faced the consequences. But I didn't. I chose the coward's path, silence. I thought silence was safer than truth. I thought maybe if I buried it deep enough, time would cover it over, like dirt over a grave. I couldn't have been more wrong. What I didn't understand back then was that silence doesn't erase guilt, it amplifies it. And the longer I stayed quiet, the heavier it grew. The real punishment wasn't being found out. The real punishment was waking up every morning knowing exactly what I had done and realizing I couldn't undo it. It started like nothing. That's the part that still haunts me, how ordinary the beginning felt. There wasn't some dramatic setup, no plan to ruin everything. Just an evening that should have been harmless. I remember the setting clearly. A small gathering with people I had known for years. Too much wine on the table, the kind of background music you barely notice. Laughter that felt louder the later the night went on. I wasn't looking for trouble, or at least that's what I tell myself. But temptation doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as comfort. One moment I was sitting, talking, feeling restless in that vague way I always did. And then there was a look, the kind that lingers just a little too long. A hand brushing mine as if by accident. My stomach tightened, and a part of me knew this was already wrong. But instead of pulling away, I told myself it was harmless. Just a look, just a hand. Except it wasn't. The night blurred after that. Words got softer, space between us got smaller, and every warning bell in my head was ringing. I remember thinking, I should leave. I should go home. I should stop this right now. But then another thought cut through it, sharp and poisonous. Nobody has to know. And that was it. That single thought tipped me over the edge. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even passionate. It was clumsy, reckless, and over too quickly. But it was enough. Enough to cross the line I could never uncross. When it was over, I sat there staring at the floor, my chest heavy, my throat tight. I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because I didn't know what else to do. She laughed too, as if it was nothing, as if we'd just shared a joke that nobody else would get. And maybe for her, it was just that. But for me, it was a sentence I had just handed down on myself. Walking home that night felt surreal. The streets were quiet, my house glowing faintly in the distance. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, and there they were, my family, asleep, peaceful, trusting. My partner's shoes by the door, the faint smell of dinner still in the air. I stood there frozen, guilt already pressing down so hard I could barely breathe. I told myself I could bury it, that it was just one night, that I would carry it with me and protect them from ever knowing. I kissed my partner's forehead as she stirred slightly in her sleep, whispering a half-hearted goodnight, pretending I was just late from the gathering. She smiled drowsily, no suspicion in her eyes, no reason to doubt me. That moment should have brought relief, but it didn't. Instead, I felt the weight of my choice settle in like a stone tied to my chest. I thought I had escaped, that silence would keep me safe. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This was only the beginning. But that was just the first crack, and once a crack appears, the whole wall is bound to collapse. The strange thing about guilt is how it makes you notice things you never paid attention to before. Every silence feels loaded. Every glance feels like an accusation. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but that didn't stop my chest from tightening every time my partner looked at me a second too long. At first, it was small. A question about why I came home later than usual that night. I had an answer ready. Too ready, probably. We stayed longer, just catching up. She nodded, but there was this pause, just long enough to make me sweat. That pause echoed in my head for days. Then came the little details I couldn't control. The smell of unfamiliar perfume on my shirt. Faint, but there. I washed it immediately, hoping she hadn't noticed. A text that flashed on my phone before I could delete it. Nothing explicit, but suggestive enough. She didn't say anything when she saw the screen light up, but I could feel her eyes linger, her lips press into a thin line. I started overcompensating, bringing flowers home randomly, cooking dinner when I never used to, laughing too loudly at her jokes. I thought if I acted like the perfect partner, I could erase the doubt before it grew. But instead, it made everything worse. The more effort I put in, the more obvious it became that I was trying to cover something. The real breaking point came one night at the dinner table. It was quiet, just the two of us eating. She set down her fork, looked straight at me, and asked, "Is there something you want to tell me?" My heart dropped into my stomach. My hands froze around the glass I was holding. I wanted to say yes, to spill everything, to end the silence that was eating me alive. But I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, and instead, I shook my head. No. Why would you ask that? Her eyes searched mine for a long time before she looked away. She didn't push further, but the air between us was different after that. Heavier. Thicker. From that night on, the suspicion lived with us like a third person in the room. It was there when we sat on the couch, when we brushed our teeth side by side, when we tried to sleep. She never confronted me directly again, but I could feel it. The doubt, the unease, the way she studied me when she thought I wasn't looking. And the worst part? I couldn't even blame her. She didn't have proof. She didn't have evidence. But she had intuition, and intuition doesn't need evidence to destroy trust. Every sound of a message on my phone made me flinch. Every time she picked up my shirt to fold it, I imagined her finding something I'd missed. I was living in a constant state of paranoia, waiting for the moment she would finally see through me. And deep down, I knew it was coming. Then one night, I found something that confirmed my worst fears. She was already looking for the truth. I had been living in limbo, half convinced she knew, half hoping she didn't. But the truth about secrets is that they don't vanish. They sit, waiting to be uncovered, and all it takes is one careless detail. It happened on a quiet evening, almost too quiet. She was scrolling through my phone, something she rarely ever did. Normally I would have snatched it back, made a joke, anything to stop her. But that night, I froze. My hands literally refused to move, and in that hesitation, she found what I had been praying she wouldn't. A message, not even a long one. Just a handful of words, casual, playful, but loaded with implication. Enough that any reasonable person could connect the dots. I saw her face change as she read it. Her lips parted slightly, her brow furrowed, and then her eyes met mine with a look I'll never forget. It wasn't anger. Not at first. It was something worse, a kind of stillness, like the silence after a glass shatters. Who is she? The question hung in the air like smoke. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. My brain was scrambling, searching for a way out, an explanation that could undo what she had just seen. But there wasn't one. The proof was right there in her hands. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed, my voice too shaky to sound believable. She laughed, not the kind of laugh I used to love, but sharp, bitter, disbelieving. "Don't lie to me. Not now." And just like that, The thin layer of denial I had been hiding under was ripped away. She knew, and no amount of silence, no flowers, no extra dinners cooked could undo it. I tried to speak, to apologize, to explain that it was just once, that it didn't mean anything. But the words sounded pathetic even to me. Because how do you explain betrayal? How do you make just once sound like anything other than what it is? A choice to destroy trust. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood up. She didn't yell. She didn't throw anything. She just stood there, looking at me like I was a stranger in her house. And in that moment, I realized I had lost something I could never get back. The silence that followed was deafening. I reached out, but she stepped back. That tiny motion said more than any words could. A barrier had formed between us, invisible but impenetrable. That night, we didn't sleep in the same bed. I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my chest burning with a mix of shame and panic. I kept replaying it in my head, the exact second her eyes locked on mine. The look that said she saw me differently now. And I knew, no matter how hard I tried, that look would haunt me forever. I thought maybe, with time, I could repair the damage. That maybe forgiveness was possible. But I was wrong. That moment wasn't the beginning of repair. It was the point of no return. And the next morning, she showed me just how deep her hurt went, in a way I never saw coming. The morning after felt like stepping into a world I didn't recognize. The house was the same, the light coming through the kitchen window just as soft as ever, but the air, it was different. Heavy, unforgiving. She moved quietly, avoiding my eyes, every gesture precise and cold. When she finally spoke, it wasn't anger that cut me down. It was calm, too calm. "I can't even look at you right now," she said, sliding a mug of coffee across the table without meeting my gaze. "I thought I knew who you were." I really did. Her words stung worse than shouting ever could. Anger can fade. Disappointment like that carves itself into your bones. I tried to talk, to explain, to beg. But the more I spoke, the more I realized words were useless. It was one night. I kept repeating, like that made a difference. It didn't mean anything. She looked up at me then, and her eyes were red, not from rage, but from hours of crying I hadn't even noticed. "It meant everything," she whispered. "Because you chose it. You chose her over us, even if just for a night. And now I'll never see you the same way again." Those words didn't just hit me, they hollowed me out. And then came the part one hadn't considered, the part that made the walls feel like they were closing in. She told her sister, her mother. She couldn't hold it in. She needed someone to lean on. And in doing so, my mistakes spread like wildfire. Suddenly, it wasn't just between us anymore. When I went to see her family the following weekend, I felt the shift instantly. Polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Conversations that ended the second I walked into the room. Her father barely shook my hand. Her mother didn't even look at me. That's when I realized this wasn't going to stay in our house. This wasn't just my wife's pain. It was a wound that stretched outward, pulling in everyone connected to us. Friends, family, even neighbors who started whispering when we passed by. I had taken a private mistake and turned it into a public shadow. I started noticing changes in her, too. She stayed out later, spent more nights with her sister, avoided the routines we used to share. When she was home, the silence was unbearable. She didn't scream, didn't throw accusations anymore. She didn't have to. The absence of warmth said it all. And every time I thought about reaching out, about holding her, something inside me reminded me that I was the one who had built this wall. I told myself I could fix it, that if I just gave her time, she would see how much I regretted it. But the more I waited, the more I saw her slipping away. The more I realized this wasn't just a fight we'd recover from. This was the beginning of the end, not just of our marriage, but of the person I thought I was. And yet, as unbearable as it was, I didn't know that the worst was still ahead, because losing her trust was only the first step in losing everything else. Nights became the hardest part. Days I could fill with work, distractions, errands that didn't really matter. But when the house grew quiet, when the world slowed down, I was left alone with my thoughts, and they tore me apart. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, rehearsing conversations in my head. Sometimes I pictured myself breaking down in front of her, confessing every detail, begging her to see how much I hated myself for what I had done. Other times, I imagined packing a bag, walking out the door, sparing her the sight of me altogether. Both versions felt like losing. The truth was, I didn't know what fighting for us was supposed to look like. Do I flood her with apologies? Do I give her space? Do I admit every ugly detail? Or do I protect her from knowing too much? Every option felt wrong. Every path ended with the same wall. The fact that I had betrayed her, and nothing could rewrite that. I started writing letters I never gave her. Pages of raw confessions, desperate promises, explanations that were more excuses than anything else. I'd tear them up afterward, ashamed that I thought words could patch something so broken. There were moments when I almost convinced myself to come clean fully, to sit her down and tell her everything. Not just the fact of the betrayal, but the why behind it. The restlessness, the emptiness I hadn't admitted even to myself. Maybe if she understood, maybe if I laid bare the ugliness inside me, she would see I wasn't a monster. Just a weak man who made a selfish mistake. But then I would see her face, the distance in her eyes, the way she barely touched her plate at dinner. And fear would grip me. Fear that telling her more would only drive the final nail into the coffin. So I stayed quiet, trapped between the urge to confess and the instinct to protect myself. Meanwhile, the gap between us widened. She stopped saying goodnight. She stopped asking how my day was. The little rituals that once made our house feel alive now felt like echoes in an empty room. And I kept wondering, was this her way of punishing me, or was she already deciding to move on without me? My mind spun with strategies I never acted on. Counseling, weekend trips, grand gestures. I researched therapists late at night, bookmarked numbers I never called. I looked up flights, thought about surprising her with a getaway, as if a change of scenery could erase the memory of my betrayal. But every idea collapsed under the same realization: nothing I planned was for her. It was all for me. Every strategy was just another desperate attempt to escape the guilt gnawing at my insides. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I sat at the kitchen table until sunrise, staring at the blank page of yet another letter. My hand hovered over the pen, trembling, my chest tight with indecision. I knew I had to do something. Anything. Because silence was killing us both. And just as I was about to write, I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She stood in the doorway, watching me with unreadable eyes. And in that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. Maybe she had already made her choice, and I was the only one still pretending we had one left to make. Cliffhanger. I spent sleepless nights planning, but when the moment finally came, I knew I had to act, and nothing could prepare me for how it would turn out. Nights became the hardest part. Days I could fill with work, distractions, errands that didn't really matter. But when the house grew quiet, when the world slowed down, I was left alone with my thoughts, and they tore me apart. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, rehearsing conversations in my head. Sometimes I pictured myself breaking down in front of her, confessing every detail, begging her to see how much I hated myself for what I had done. Other times, I imagined packing a bag, walking out the door, sparing her the sight of me altogether. Both versions felt like losing. The truth was, I didn't know what fighting for us was supposed to look like. Do I flood her with apologies? Do I give her space? Do I admit every ugly detail? Or do I protect her from knowing too much? Every option felt wrong. Every path ended with the same wall. The fact that I had betrayed her, and nothing could rewrite that. I started writing letters I never gave her. Pages of raw confessions, desperate promises, explanations that were more excuses than anything else. I'd tear them up afterward, ashamed that I thought words could patch something so broken. There were moments when I almost convinced myself to come clean fully, to sit her down and tell her everything. Not just the fact of the betrayal, but the why behind it. The restlessness, the emptiness I hadn't admitted even to myself. Maybe if she understood, maybe if I laid bare the ugliness inside me, she would see I wasn't a monster. Just a weak man who made a selfish mistake. But then I would see her face, the distance in her eyes, the way she barely touched her plate at dinner. And fear would grip me. Fear that telling her more would only drive the final nail into the coffin. So I stayed quiet, trapped between the urge to confess and the instinct to protect myself. Meanwhile, the gap between us widened. She stopped saying goodnight. She stopped asking how my day was. The little rituals that once made our house feel alive now felt like echoes in an empty room. And I kept wondering, was this her way of punishing me, or was she already deciding to move on without me? My mind spun with strategies I never acted on. Counseling, weekend trips, grand gestures. I researched therapists late at night, bookmarked numbers I never called. I looked up flights, thought about surprising her with a getaway, as if a change of scenery could erase the memory of my betrayal. But every idea collapsed under the same realization: nothing I planned was for her. It was all for me. Every strategy was just another desperate attempt to escape the guilt gnawing at my insides. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I sat at the kitchen table until sunrise, staring at the blank page of yet another letter. My hand hovered over the pen, trembling, my chest tight with indecision. I knew I had to do something. Anything. Because silence was killing us both. And just as I was about to write, I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She stood in the doorway, watching me with unreadable eyes, and in that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. Maybe she had already made her choice, and I was the only one still pretending we had one left to make. I spent sleepless nights planning, but when the moment finally came, I knew I had to act, and nothing could prepare me for how it would turn out. I finally convinced myself that doing nothing was worse than failing. Silence was killing us, so I had to break it. One Saturday morning, when the house felt still enough to shatter, I asked her to sit down. My voice cracked as I spoke, my palms sweaty against the edge of the table. "I know sorry doesn't cut it," I began, "but I need you to hear me. I love you. I made a mistake, the worst one of my life. And I'll regret it until the day I die. But I want to fight for us. Please, give me that chance." Her eyes stayed fixed on the coffee in her hands. For what felt like forever, she said nothing. And then, finally, she exhaled. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I don't want to throw away years of our life without trying." For the first time in months, hope sparked in my chest. It was small, fragile, but it was there. I grabbed onto it like a drowning man reaching for a life raft. We tried. We really did. We went on long walks together, cooked meals side by side like we used to, even laughed once or twice when old jokes resurfaced. There were nights when she let me hold her again, and in those moments, I almost believed the worst was behind us. I started thinking maybe redemption was possible. Maybe this didn't have to define the rest of our lives. The guilt was still there, sharp and heavy, but it was softened by the thought that we were healing. But the cracks never really sealed. I noticed it in her eyes first. Even when she smiled, there was a distance, a flicker of something she couldn't mask. Distrust, pain, a wound that hadn't closed. And though she tried not to say it, her actions whispered it constantly. The way she double-checked my phone bill, the way she stiffened when I stayed out late for work, the way she seemed to measure every word I spoke as if weighing its truth. One evening, I came home to find her sitting at the table with a notebook. Inside, I saw pages filled with questions, lists, pros and cons of staying versus leaving. My heart dropped. I had been living in this fragile illusion of repair, but she was still keeping score. When I asked her about it, she didn't deny it. She looked me in the eye and said, "I'm trying, but every time I look at you, I see that night. I don't know if I'll ever stop." Her honesty cut deeper than any accusation. It told me what I hadn't wanted to admit. Forgiveness wasn't a destination we were moving toward. It was a mirage I had been chasing, and she was too exhausted to keep pretending she believed in it. For a while, I clung to the scraps of normalcy, telling myself progress was progress, no matter how small. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew the truth. We weren't rebuilding. We were delaying the inevitable. I thought it was over, that we were healing. But I couldn't have been more wrong, because the storm that came next would tear apart whatever fragile hope we had left. I had told myself we were moving forward, but it only took one spark to burn away that fragile illusion. It started with her family. We were invited to her parents' house for dinner, the first time since everything came out. I dressed carefully, rehearsed polite words in my head, desperate to prove I wasn't the villain they thought I was. The moment we walked in, though, I felt it. The stiffness in the air, the way conversation slowed when I entered the room. Her mother's smile was tight, her father's handshake limp. They hadn't forgiven, and they weren't about to pretend they had. Throughout dinner, I caught whispers exchanged across the table. Her sister avoided my eyes entirely. When I tried to engage, the responses were clipped, cold. My wife noticed it too, her shoulders tense, her face flushed with embarrassment. She defended me once, snapping at her sister for a sarcastic comment, but the damage was done. I had not only lost her trust, I had lost the respect of everyone connected to her. And it didn't stop there. Word spread, as it always does. Friends grew distant. Invitations dried up. People I'd known for years suddenly had excuses not to meet. It was like I had been branded, my mistake carved into my skin for the world to see. At home, the tension only deepened. She had promised to try, but trying doesn't erase suspicion. Every late text I sent, every time I glanced at my phone, I saw the shadow cross her face. One night, after I came home later than usual, she confronted me. Was it her again? No, I said instantly, too quickly. Her silence was worse than yelling. She just turned away, climbed into bed, and left me standing in the doorway with my heart in my throat. I wanted to scream that I hadn't done it again, that it really was just once. But the truth was, once was enough. Once was enough to make every word I said sound hollow. The next blow came from an angle I hadn't expected. We had mutual friends, couples we used to see on weekends. One of them pulled me aside after a gathering and said quietly, "She deserves better. You know that, right?" I didn't argue. I couldn't. Because he was right. That night, my wife barely spoke to me on the drive home. When we got inside, she sat down on the couch, her hands trembling as she said, "I don't think I can do this anymore. I've tried, but everywhere I go, people look at me like a fool. Like I'm the woman who stayed with a man who betrayed her. Do you understand how humiliating that is?" Her voice cracked, and I felt something inside me collapse. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the image of us, the way the world saw her because of me. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. Even if she wanted to forgive me, maybe she couldn't. Because forgiveness doesn't change how everyone else sees you. What happened next made me question everything. Because for the first time, I saw that saving our marriage might not even be my choice anymore. I used to think the worst part of betrayal was the moment of being caught. I was wrong. The worst part was everything that came after. The slow erosion of love, the way silence replaced laughter, the way home no longer felt like home. Nights became unbearable. I slept on the couch more often than in our bed. Even when I did climb under the covers beside her, the distance between us felt like miles. She lay turned away, her breathing steady, while I stared at the ceiling, my chest tight with the crushing weight of regret. One night, I broke. I whispered into the darkness, not even sure if she was awake. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to make it right, but I'd give anything to go back. Just tell me what to do." She didn't answer. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls themselves were suffocating me. And then, quietly, she said, "You can't undo it. That's the problem. I don't know if I'll ever be able to love you the way I did before." Her words carved through me like glass. I had braced myself for anger, for rejection, even for divorce. But hearing that she couldn't love me the same way, that was the death sentence. Because what's a marriage without love? From that night on, I knew we were living on borrowed time. I stopped eating much. Work suffered. Friends stopped calling. The guilt didn't just weigh on me. It consumed me. I saw it in the mirror. Hollow eyes, tired skin, a man unraveling. People at the office noticed, but I brushed it off with excuses. How could I explain that I wasn't sick? I was just rotting from the inside out. The final blow came on a Sunday morning. We were supposed to visit her parents, but she told me to stay home. "It's easier that way," she said flatly, as she grabbed her keys. I watched from the window as she drove off, and in that moment, I felt the truth crash down on me. I was no longer her partner. I was an obligation, a shadow she carried but wished she could shake off. The house was silent after she left. I wandered through it like a ghost, touching the photos on the walls, the souvenirs from trips we once loved, the life we had built together. And for the first time, I let myself admit it. I had destroyed it all. With one night, one mistake, I had burned down everything we had. I dropped to the floor in the living room, my body shaking as sobs tore out of me. It wasn't dignified. It wasn't controlled. It was raw, ugly grief for a life I had thrown away with my own hands. In that moment, I thought about leaving, not just the house, but everything. About disappearing, letting her rebuild without the weight of me dragging her down. But even that felt selfish, like another escape instead of facing what I had done. And that's when it hit me. The only thing left was acceptance. Acceptance that there was no fixing this, no erasing it, no redemption waiting around the corner. The rest of my life would be lived in the shadow of one night I could never take back. And yet, even in that darkest moment, I realized I had one final choice left, one that would decide how this story ended. It happened on a Tuesday evening, of all times, so ordinary, so unremarkable, Yet it became the night that split my life into before and after. She came home later than usual, her expression distant, her movements deliberate. I could feel the heaviness in the air before she even opened her mouth. She didn't sit down, didn't take off her coat. She just stood there, keys still in her hand, and said, "We need to talk." Those 4 words chilled me. I nodded, throat dry, and waited. "I've been trying," she said quietly. "God knows I've been trying. But it's not working. Every time I look at you, I see what you did. I feel it in the pit of my stomach. I can't shake it. And it's killing me." Her voice cracked, but her eyes stayed steady. "I don't want to hate you. But if I stay, I will. And I can't live like that. We can't live like that." I tried to speak, but my mouth felt like sand. Finally, I managed. "Are you saying it's over?" She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, filled with tears. "It has to be. I don't want to, but I have no choice." The words hit me harder than any scream, any insult could, because she wasn't saying it out of spite. She was saying it out of exhaustion, out of heartbreak, out of the certainty that we had reached a point beyond repair. I begged. I dropped to my knees in front of her, the weight of desperation pouring out of me. "Please, don't give up on us. I'll do anything. Counseling, moving, starting over, anything. Just don't walk away." She shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get it. It's not about what you'll do. It's about what you already did. That's the part that can't be undone." Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I realized then that this was the end. No grand gesture, no heartfelt plea could rewrite the past. She placed the keys on the table, her final gesture, and walked into the bedroom. When she came out, she had a small suitcase in her hand. "I'll stay at my sister's for now," she said softly. "We'll figure out the rest later." And then she was gone. The door clicked shut, and with it, the last shred of hope I had been clinging to. I stood in the empty living room, staring at the space she had just occupied, and felt my chest cave in. Everything was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that screams. I dropped into the chair at the table, burying my face in my hands, and for the first time, the full weight of it all pressed down with no illusion, no denial, no false hope. I had lost her. I had lost us. And it was my fault. And in that silence, I finally understood the truth. One mistake doesn't just change a night. It changes a life, forever. The weeks that followed blurred together, but the silence never softened. The house echoed with absence. Her shoes missing from the doorway, her laughter no longer spilling from the kitchen, her toothbrush gone from the bathroom sink. Every corner screamed of her, but she wasn't there. Papers came eventually, neatly folded, clinical in their finality. Divorce filings. I stared at them for hours before signing, my hand trembling as if I could stall the inevitable by moving slower. The sound of the pen scratching across the page felt like nails carving into stone. With each stroke, I buried the last pieces of a life I had taken for granted. Friends pulled away, some out of loyalty to her, others because betrayal makes people uncomfortable, as if it's contagious. Invitations stopped. Conversations dried up. I became the man people whispered about, but no longer called. I couldn't blame them. I didn't want to be around me either. Nights stretched long and unbearable. I replayed that night in my head 1,000 times, trying to imagine what would have happened if I'd just walked away, if I'd just chosen differently. But the truth never changed. I hadn't. And that single choice had rewritten my life in ways I could never undo. Sometimes, I scroll through old photos, vacations, anniversaries, quiet mornings on the porch. We look happy in them, and for the most part, we were. Which makes it harder. Because I realize I didn't destroy something broken. I destroyed something good. Something rare. The worst part isn't losing her. It's knowing that she lost me too. The version of me she believed in. The man she thought she married. And he's gone. I killed him the moment I betrayed her. What's left is just the shell that remains. Walking through life carrying the weight of a mistake no one can forgive, least of all myself. People tell you time heals, but they don't say what time actually does. It doesn't erase. It dulls. It turns sharp pain into a constant ache you learn to live with, like a limp you never recover from. Some days, I almost forget. And then I pass by the restaurant where we celebrated our anniversary, or I hear a song we used to sing in the car, and the wound rips open again. If there's anything I've learned, it's this. Betrayal isn't just a moment. It's a shadow. It follows you. It stretches across every part of your life, and no matter how much light you try to bring in, it never fully disappears. I made one mistake. Just one. And yet, its cost is infinite. Now, I live alone. The walls don't judge, the furniture doesn't ask questions, but the silence is louder than any voice could be. I carry my guilt like a second skin, invisible to others, but impossible for me to shed. And maybe that's the truest punishment of all. Not the divorce, not the loneliness, not the whispers, but the knowledge that I had something precious, something people spend lifetimes searching for, and I was the one who destroyed it. And for the rest of my life, I'll wake up every morning knowing that one mistake was all it took to lose everything. If you've stayed with me until now, maybe part of you understands the weight I carry. Or maybe you're shaking your head, thinking I deserve every bit of it, and you'd be right. One mistake doesn't excuse itself just because it only happened once. Sometimes once is all it takes to tear a life apart. I don't share this story to ask for sympathy. I share it because silence eats you alive. And if even one person hears this and chooses differently, if someone walks away instead of giving in to that impulse, then maybe my pain serves a purpose. We all make mistakes. Some small, some so big they change everything. Mine was the latter, and I'll spend the rest of my life living with the shadow of that choice. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or the weight of regret, you know how deep it cuts. Share your thoughts below. Maybe someone else needs to hear them. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing. You're not alone in your scars.